Hello, everyone. My name is Ifeoluwa Ogunyinka. I'm a junior global studies major and communication arts and science minor at Penn State Berks. Today, I'll be discussing my research on Nollywood in Obodo, Oyibo, which means white man's land, and I'll be focusing on how Nigerian comedies critique the Nigerian diasporic experience in the West. For this presentation, I'll be focusing on describing the scope of Nollywood. I'll be discussing satire and comedy as seen in Nollywood films, as well as diasporic themes in the early 2000s and 2010s in Nollywood. The film industry, or film, was first introduced in Nigeria in the 1900s, in the early 1900s. These films were produced by Western writers and directors, and they promoted Western narratives. For instance, the movie on the left, Sanders of the River, talked about a British general who saves a Nigerian village. The village falls apart when he leaves, and then when he returns, the village is saved. And then now, present day, the movie on the right, the Bling Logosians, represents movies that are made now in Nigeria, which focus on Nigerian pride. This specific movie focuses on the 1% of the 1% richest people in Nigeria and their affluent lives. So Nollywood, specifically as a film industry, is the third largest film industry in the world. There's Hollywood, which is most popular, and then Bollywood and Nollywood. Nollywood, which is Nigerian Hollywood, focuses more on African stories. A lot of its audiences are Africans in diaspora, which are Africans living outside of Africa, as well as Africans in the continent. But the Nollywood film industry has a huge reach around the world as well. So satire and comedy in Nollywood is one of the biggest genres within the film industry. Nollywood uses satire and comedy a lot of the times to discuss deep-rooted social issues as well as environmental issues. For instance, the movie on the left, Akinakwa, which was released in the early 2000s, focuses on the mischievous lives of two young boys. However, the movie is very adept in pointing out the social justice problems with how there's a disconnect between education and actual education the students receive, the education system and the education they receive, and how that kind of breaks down from the family level. The movie on the right as well, Ukwa, focuses on a man who is unable to work and provide for his family. This is someone who is able-bodied to work, but because of the system, the employment system and lack of employment, he has become a burden to his family. So these movies in Nollywood use satire and comedy to really hammer on the actual problems that Nigerians are facing, their nuanced experiences. Moving forward, the diasporic themes that I identified within Nollywood films were very interesting. I found myself interested in this topic after watching a few Western films, and I noticed that a lot of the times when Africans are depicted in these films as side characters or as extras, there's always the stereotype of being the colorfully dressed person who is kind of loud and bogus and doesn't really have any other thoughts aside from just being funny. I found this especially prominent in the recent Spider-Man movie, Homecoming. And in that movie, within their debate group, within Spider-Man's debate group, they had an African student whose jokes were kind of bogus and funny, and he never really said anything of substance within the movie. And when everyone else, every other side character within that debate group spoke, they had something more intelligible to say than he did. And I found this as a trend in a lot of Western films as well. So I also realized that when Nollywood talks about these kind of diasporic themes about Africans living outside of Africa, there is this kind of disconnect between how it is discussed in the 2000s as opposed to when it's discussed in the 2010s. So I found there's some of a kind of glamorization of Western culture in the 2000s where there's so much love and excitement about being in the West, and then there's a rejection from Western culture in 2010s where the message is come back home, life is better back in your African country. Looking at that, I found that these movies in the 2010s and 2000s that talk about diasporic discourse have three main stages that the films go through, and these three main stages don't particularly follow the usual sequence of start, climax, finish of a film. The three stages are the honeymoon stage, the intermediate stage, as well as the return home. So for the honeymoon stage, this is where the opportunity to travel to the West is introduced in the film. This is usually not the start of the film, but for instance, in Osofia in London, which was made in 2003. And actually, this film was was the first film, Nollywood film, to actually be filmed in the West and represent Nigerian diasporic discourse as well as African diasporic discourse. In this film, the main character finds out that he has this opportunity to claim wealth from his brother in London, so he travels to London. There is so much excitement during this stage. The arrival to the West, the culture shock is usually very positive, being surprised by the different cultures, addressing the language, the food. And there's usually, especially in the 2000s, an acceptance of the Western culture of the Nigerian or the African in the film, where they're more susceptible to help out and this person doesn't receive any kind of negative feedback. In the early 2000s, this stage in the film is kind of prolonged, where it takes 5 to 10 minutes just expressing how happy this person is about either leaving their home to go to the West or just being in the West and enjoying the culture. Within the 2010s, where we see the rejection of Western culture, this part of the film is usually shorter. There's less appreciation coming from their home base. And there's a lot of expectation and weight placed on this character to actually succeed and get something substantial from their trip abroad. In the intermediate stage, this stage is usually marked by when the character gets lost in the city. So in Osofia in London, he steps out of the limo that came to pick him from the airport, and then he gets lost on a bus. In the movie Lost in London, it's about two students who they go for a program in London. One of them completely misses the program. The other one gets kicked out right after the program ends, and both of them are lost in London. They have nowhere to go. This period is usually filled with all the negative relationships from the West, where the West is reacting more to the African culture. Here, there is kind of a struggle between assimilation and doing well. In the early 2000s, this part of the film is kind of truncated. It's not the majority of the film. It moves by really quickly, usually montage style. And the character gets out of this stage by falling in love. As well as in the 2010s, it's kind of more prolonged. This is where the bulk of the movie kind of rests. There's a focus on the struggle where there are distinct scenes instead of a montage of the characters suffering, and they also tend to fall in love at the end of the stage. Moving forward for the return home, I found that in the early 2000s, where there's this glamorization of the West, the characters returning back home to their African countries are coming back with pride, with wealth. In Osofia in London, he's coming back with the wealth that he wanted to get from his brother. In London Boy, which is 2004, he's coming back with a white girlfriend as fiance, as well as citizenship in London. So he's more accomplished. In the 2010s, this part of the film has a lot of shame addressed to it, where the characters are forced to come back home. There isn't that happiness. They didn't achieve their goal. Their expectations versus the realities really shifted. And I think this might have to do with some of the change in immigration laws between the 2000 and 2010, specifically between Nigeria and Great Britain. So there is that awareness that, and that reality check that experiences abroad aren't always what you want them to be. In the 2000s, they were great, but in 2010s, people are coming back less and less successful, and coming back not because they want to, but because they have no choice but to return back home. And now this makes me question what the kind of future is for Nollywood films that talk about diasporic discourse. I found these two movies, The Wedding Party and Wedding Party 2, were released in 2016 and 2017. And I think they give a kind of insight into what's going to happen in the 2020s in terms of diasporic relationships shown within Nollywood films. In Wedding Party, there's the presence of a white British lady who is a friend of one of the main characters. She's a bridesmaid, and she's kind of caricatured within the film. She's just a bogus white person who's trying to assimilate. And in the second part, her parents are the ones who are seeing that way. So I find it very interesting that there's kind of that shift where Spider-Man is making African people look kind of bogus and funny, and then Nollywood films are doing the same thing for white people, making them look bogus and funny. So maybe there's going to be a balance in the 2020s. I don't know yet. If you have any other questions, I've left links to my bibliography as well as my information within the description of this video. Thanks so much for listening to my research. Have a great day.